Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with Oxtail Ragu. That's right, the only thing my audience likes more than when things come out perfectly is when they don't. And I'm not exactly sure why people enjoy it so much when I do screw up. Who knows, maybe it's the occasional mistake that makes people think I'm just like them. Which of course I'm not. But anyway, despite one of the dumbest cooking decisions I've made in a long time, this still came out incredibly delicious. Mostly thanks to these. So we will start this recipe by getting some tail. Oxtail to be exact. And while I really do wish it came from oxen, it doesn't. This is nothing more than the cut-up tail of a big old cow. And if you've never worked with this before, it is one of the most flavorful, most gelatinous cuts of meat on the entire cow. Which means two things: a ton of flavor, and that it takes a really long time to cook. And because my plan here was to cook this in some tomato sauce for a pasta, I wanted to brown it very well first like we usually do. But because of the odd shape of these pieces, it isn't that easy to brown in a pan. So I decided to do it in a very hot oven instead. So I seasoned it very thoroughly with salt and freshly ground black pepper, and placed it on a bed of chopped onions, which contained a little bit of garlic, and I popped that in a nice hot oven for 425 for about 45 minutes to an hour, or until it was very nicely browned. And yes, I did turn that halfway through. And as you can see, that hot oven did a very nice job at caramelizing that meat, much more thoroughly than we could have done with a pan. And at this point, we would normally transfer all this into our sauce pot, add the rest of the ingredients, and simmer till tender. But that's not what happened, because I had what I thought was a brilliant idea. I thought to myself, why not just dump all the sauce ingredients into this pan and finish this in the oven as a braised dish? Man, that's genius. Why hasn't anyone else thought of this? So I dumped in a little bit of wine vinegar, which is to balance what is a very sweet meat, as well as some tomato sauce. I also went ahead and added some chicken broth. And by the way, oxtails are so flavorful, you really can just use water. But I had a little stock to use up, so I tossed it in. So that's up to you. You guys are the boss of what eventually, no matter what you use, will be an incredibly delicious sauce. I also had some fresh herbs around, so I tossed in some rosemary, thyme, and oregano. And then I finished up with some kosher salt, as well as some chili flakes. And once I had that seasoned up, I continued on with this ill-fated strategy, which included covering this up with a piece of crinkled up parchment paper. If you crinkle it up, it's easier to work with. And what that does is kind of cover and protect the product in the pan, as well as allow for evaporation, which is of course going to help concentrate the flavors. So I covered that up and popped it in a nice slow oven, about 300, and I let it go for a couple hours, at which point I pulled it out to take a look. And basically what I discovered is that what was happening was not much. I mean, it kind of looked like stuff was happening. The meat was taking on a dark and dangerous looking color, which is generally a good thing. But as soon as I started turning these with the tongs, I could feel they were still very hard and firm. And they sort of felt like hockey pucks. So it became clear at this point these were going to need a lot more time. And I did start having second thoughts, and was actually considering stopping and transferring these into a pot and simmering them as per usual. But unfortunately, my stubbornness trumped my common sense, pardon the expression, and I decided after turning them over, I would pop them back in without the paper for a couple more hours to see what would happen. And by the way, in case you're wondering why I'm not doing those little captions with the times and temperatures, well, that's because you guys are not going to do this step. So I popped it in for a few more hours, at which point I pulled it out to check, and it was deja vu all over again. As soon as I felt them with the tongs, I realized these are still not even close to being cooked. But just to get a second opinion, I went ahead and checked with a knife anyway. So it looks like it slides in nicely, but I could definitely feel it wasn't tender enough, and that meat was still very much attached to the bone. Okay, if you only remember one thing from this video, it's that oxtails are not really edible until that meat will pull easily and cleanly off the bone. So it was at this moment that I finally admitted defeat and went ahead and transferred everything into a sauce pot, as I should have done from the beginning. And I even rinsed out that goodness from the roasting pan with a little more stock. And once I got everything into the pot, I felt a lot better. So to summarize, we are going to do the beginning step, where we brown our oxtails with our onion mixture. But once that's been done, you're just going to transfer everything into this pot and simmer it on low until very tender. Which, believe it or not, is going to take about 4 or 5 hours, depending on the size. I mean, these actually required a couple more hours of simmering, even though these had been in the oven forever. And besides waiting for them to get tender, the only other thing you're going to have to do is probably skim some fat from the top. Oxtails are going to release a tremendous amount of fat, so I do like to skim almost all of that off. But really, that's all you got to do. Just skim off the fat, give it a stir once in a while, and simply wait for it to be done. And how you know your oxtails have cooked long enough is this. If you grab one of the larger pieces and take a fork and the meat will kind of pull off the bone clean like this, you are done. I know, finally. And of course, because you've watched countless hundreds of Food Wishes videos, you know you got to grab a spoon and taste this before you serve it, in case it needs any more salt or spice or whatever. And mine was fine. I had adjusted it off camera, which meant I was ready to serve up on some rigatoni. And some people like to do an extra step here and actually pull all that meat off the bone and put it back in. But personally, I much prefer this presentation. Plus, I've always felt things taste a little better when you have to do a little bit of work to get the meat, which is why I've always considered oxtail sort of the lobster of beef. But anyway, I'm going to serve that up on some pasta with a little bit of extra sauce. And then I finished up with a nice gradient of Parmigiano Reggiano, as well as some freshly chopped Italian parsley. And as the wise man once said, all's well that ends well. And man, did this end well. And speaking of old sayings, have you ever heard the one that goes, the closer the bone, the sweeter the meat? It was oxtails that made me realize what that actually means. Since for me, this is by far the most flavorful, most beefy, sweetest, richest, most succulent meat on the entire cow. Or ox, for that matter. So yes, my attempt to braise these in a low oven was a big failure. But this eventually came out so deliciously, I didn't care. I mean, come on, what are we doing here anyway? We're here to have fun, learn things, and for me personally, continue to avoid actual work. So no harm, no foul, as I sneak in one last cliche. And I should mention, if you eat this with a knife and a fork, you can get every little scrap off those bones really easily. But I actually prefer another method. Instead of getting a knife dirty for no reason, once I'm done working those over with a fork, I simply pick those up and suck every last succulent scrap of meat off that vertebrae. It is a lot of fun and delicious and quite a scene. So with that visual in mind, I'll finish up by saying I really do hope you give these a try soon. So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.